In this edition of Global Print, I'm going to talk to you about the visit by the External Affairs Minister, Mr. S Jaishankar, to the Maldives and Sri Lanka these last few days. Now, Mr. Jaishankar left for the Maldives on the 26th of March, just as the Chinese Foreign Minister Wang Yi left Delhi for Kathmandu en route home back to Beijing. And we all know that Mr. Wang Yi's visit to Delhi was very interesting. In effect, he asked India to move on from the standoff at the line of actual control in Ladakh these last couple of years. We know that Chinese troops have been facing off against Indian troops. So Mr. Wang Yi telling the Indian leadership that both big Asian nations must move on from this episode, this fracas. And we will talk about this later. But just as Mr. Wang Yi left for Kathmandu, Mr. Jaishankar left for the Maldives. He was in the Maldives for a couple of days in Addu Atoll, which is the southernmost atoll in the Maldives archipelago. From there, he flew to Colombo, where he has met the Sri Lankan leadership, including the president. And on Wednesday, Prime Minister Modi participated in a virtual summit meeting of the leaders of the Bay of Bengal community. Now, before I explain the significance of Mr. Jaishankar's visit to these Indian Ocean nations of the Maldives and Sri Lanka, dear viewer, I'd like to make an appeal to you. Please do subscribe, pay just a little bit, rupees 159 only, for the Print's free, fair, objective and unhyphenated journalism. It's very little money. All you need to do is to click on the join button, subscribe, pay that money, become a part of the Print, get these exclusive offerings that the Print has only for subscribers. Obviously, you don't get these benefits if you're not a subscriber, so I would implore you to become one. You have helped us these past several months of the pandemic, before and after, and I would urge you to continue on this journey with the Print. I look forward to you clicking on that join button, paying that very little sum of money, rupees 159 only, and becoming a subscriber. Now, back to my column, Global Print, on the Print's website, in which I talk about Mr. Jaishankar's visit to the Maldives and to Sri Lanka. Now, this was not just an ordinary visit to the Maldives and to Sri Lanka. And what is interesting is that Wang Yi, who came to Delhi from Pakistan via Afghanistan, where actually he met the Taliban leaders, including the Taliban Interior Minister Sirajuddin Haqqani. And we know that Mr. Haqqani has not just a $10 million bounty on his head, but he is also responsible for the killing of an Indian diplomat as well as an Indian military attaché in 2008 when a bomb went off in the just outside the Indian embassy in Kabul. So Mr. Wang Yi meeting Sirajuddin Haqqani, coming to Delhi, meeting External Affairs Minister S Jaishankar, where the message that was brought to India, to the Indian leadership, including to the National Security Advisor, Mr. Ajit Doval, was that India and China, two big Asian nations, must join hands and move forward into the 21st century, which is the Asian century. Of course, Mr. Wang Yi forgot one small minor thing, which is that Chinese troops, for no reason at all, have been facing off against Indian troops on the line of actual control in Ladakh for the last couple of years. Nobody knows why they came there in the first place. Nobody knows why the Chinese violated every peace and tranquility agreement and have stood there facing off against these Indian troops. So Mr. Wang Yi, expecting that the Indians are just going to, roll over, forget, smile, and move on, well, perhaps he should then understand the Indians just a little bit better. Now, there's some plausible reasons why Mr. Wang Yi came to India at all. It is said that he wanted to come to India, and certainly, if somebody wants to come to your country, you cannot refuse his or her presence. So the Indians did say, yes, please come, but it was a cold meeting. The Indian side telling him very firmly that there are differences in the perceptions of the two countries on the standoff in Ladakh, and that there is no question at all but that the Chinese troops must maintain status quo ante. And let me tell you one more thing here, dear viewer. Later this year, the BRICS summit is going to be held in China. Now, the BRICS, is an acronym for this 5-country partnership or grouping which is B for Brazil, R for Russia, India, China, and South Africa. And at this summit, Prime Minister Modi is naturally invited. So one of the things that perhaps Mr. Wang Yi was alluding to was that the Chinese would very much like the Prime Minister, Mr. Narendra Modi, to participate in this BRICS summit. But here is an ace that India holds up her sleeve as well, which is that there is no question but the Chinese troops must get off the LAC, return to status quo ante, and perhaps only then can Prime Minister Modi go to China. But we will leave this discussion and this debate for another Global Print episode. And today I'm going to talk to you about the significance of the visit of Mr. Jaishankar to the Maldives and to Sri Lanka. But, let me just take another second. Mr. Wang Yi goes to Kathmandu and Mr. Jaishankar goes to the Maldives and Sri Lanka. So the Chinese foreign minister going to a northern country in South Asia, while the Indian foreign minister goes to two of the southern nations in South Asia and in fact in the Indian Ocean. And not so long ago, what is fascinating about what's happening in this region is that not so long ago, China's footprint had expanded massively across South Asia. Until 2018, in fact, when Abdullah Yameen, the opposition leader in the Maldives, was president, he was very, very close to the Chinese, wooed the Chinese, took huge loans for investment from the Chinese. In fact, the Friendship Bridge, which is between the Mali airport and the city, has been built by the Chinese. Other huge loans taken to build various other infrastructure projects. And then Ibu Soli, who is the leader of the Maldivian Democratic Party, wins the election and becomes the president of the Maldives. And in these last 4 years, the whole story has taken a complete about turn. As Ibu Soli, the president of the Maldives, reciprocates India's neighborhood first policy, responds warmly to the Indian embrace, and welcomes Indian initiatives and Indian infrastructure projects in the Maldives. So during his visit, Mr. Jaishankar did several interesting things. The first is that he handed over, within quotes, a police academy that has been built by India to the Maldives, again in the Adu atoll, which is, like I said before, the southernmost atoll in the Maldivian archipelago. He handed over a coastal radar system. What that means is that now India will keep a constant and a watchful vigil over the Maldives across the entire coast. And you know that the Maldives is made up of several hundred islands and several atolls. In fact, Adu atoll is south of the equator. And what that does then is that if India has access to this coastal radar system, then it has access to the goings-on across the Maldivian archipelago. That's a very significant project that the Indian foreign minister has handed to the Maldivian government. So this joint partnership between India and the Maldives was very much on display. Now, in the last few months, Abdullah Yameen, the former president, the pro-China former president, has been orchestrating an India out campaign in the Maldives. And so much so that the MDP government actually wanted to ban the protests that were sloganeering in favor of India out. But I think then they saw reason, and while they haven't made a law calling for such a ban, but several protests on the India Out campaign have been disallowed recently in the Maldives. So Jaishankar's visit symbolizing the return of India to the Maldives. And that's a fascinating story in itself. So from the Maldives, Mr. Jaishankar goes to Sri Lanka, where the story of an expanding Chinese presence on that pearl-shaped island is now seeing many changes. We know that several years ago, when Mahinda Rajapaksa, in his former incarnation, allowed the Chinese to come in, build a port at Hambantota, build an airport at Matala. It's supposed to be the world's emptiest airport. There are no planes that land there. And Hambantota is Rajapaksa's own constituency. In these last years, in this decade or so, so much has changed in Sri Lanka. First of all, and most importantly, the economy has gone into a tailspin for a variety of reasons. The most important being that a decade or so ago, the Sri Lankan government shifted the stance of of its own economy from being an export-oriented economy to an inward-looking one which focused on domestic consumption. In a tiny country like Sri Lanka, being on the crossroads of the world, reaching out and sending its goods all over the world. So to be able to now look inwards, I think that was an economic disaster. Coupled with that, you had other shocks to the economy. For example, the organic farming that was introduced inside Sri Lanka. So all in all, the economy that has been undergoing a severe shock. And these last few months, so India has stepped in with a $2.4 billion loan, a short-term emergency loan supposed to bail out Sri Lanka from its economic crisis. We also saw how Mr. Jaishankar saw that a hospital in Kandy district in Peradeniya was suffering 10-hour-long power cuts and was unable to carry out even routine surgeries. So he has asked the Indian High Commission to help out. So long power cuts in the big cities of Sri Lanka, Colombo, Trincomalee, etc. And the Sri Lankans, prices going through the roof. Sri Lankans unable to buy even basic commodities because prices are so high. So India bailing out the Sri Lankans not just in terms of a short-term emergency loan, but also sending credit lines of medicines, of fuel, and other goods. So this visit of Mr. Jaishankar to Sri Lanka is also really interesting. He was, in fact, if you look at his Twitter handle, you will see that he was at a Lanka Indian Oil Corporation outlet in Colombo. Now, why is that significant? Because only a few months ago, the Indian Oil Corporation signed a joint partnership with the Sri Lankan government and created a joint venture, the Lanka IOC, the Lanka Indian Oil Corporation. And what that does is that both India and Sri Lanka have agreed that apart from importing fuel from India, India will also participate in a joint venture in the Trincomalee oil tank farms. Now, Trincomalee is a town on eastern Sri Lanka, again, a strategic port that India has been eyeing for the last several decades. In fact, since the LTTE war in the late 1980s, which the Indian Peacekeeping Force, the IPKF, helped the Sri Lankan government of the time to fight against the Tamil Tigers. So a lot of history in this visit by the External Affairs Minister. In fact, at the time, in the late 80s, he was a young diplomat at the Indian High Commission. So in a sense, he has seen history turn a full circle. Now, does this mean that India has been able to oust China from both Sri Lanka and the Maldives? That's not true yet. No, certainly not yet. But what India has been able to do is to reestablish its presence and to say that this is truly India's ocean and that India will assert itself in these parts, not just in the Indian Ocean and not just in Sri Lanka and the Maldives, but all across South Asia. And that is the message that India will send China. So Wang Yi in Kathmandu would have definitely noted and noticed all the references that the External Affairs Minister, Mr. Jaishankar, made to the partnership between India and the Maldives and later between India and Sri Lanka. He could not help but noticing the assertion that India is making again that this is India's South Asia and that while China is a welcome guest, that's what it is, just a guest. So do read my column, Global Print, on the Print's website, and I look forward to your comments on this video. Thank you so much for watching.